Hey, my name is Brad Fleming. I'm a medical student at the University of Iowa. And I had the pleasure of working with Dr. Teal and everyone on the team at MGH for a couple of years after college and before attending medical school. And I got the opportunity to research and learn about sunflower syndrome while I was working with them. And it was really fascinating. And I think one of the things that surprised us when we started looking into sunflower syndrome was that sunflower syndrome had been described in the medical literature for almost 100 years. So it was really interesting going back and reading about how individuals and researchers talked about sunflower syndrome over time. So today I'll be presenting on the history of sunflower syndrome in the medical literature. In the early 1900s, there are several researchers describing patients suffering from a range of photosensitive epilepsies or epilepsies induced by visual stimuli like flashing cameras or the movie cinemas. However, these individuals really didn't like the sources that provoked their seizures, and most of them had suffered from previous traumatic injuries to their nervous system. It wasn't really until 1932 that researchers described an individual that was otherwise healthy that seemed to induce their seizures by a natural sunlight. The case involved a 10-year-old boy who had this tic of a kind of rhythmic upward movement of his head associated with eyelid tremors. Without knowing more about the boy's clinical characteristics, it's difficult to say for sure if this was the first case of sunflower syndrome described in the literature, or if it was one of the many other photosensitive epilepsies described at the time. However, over the next couple of years, these photosensitive epilepsies became a major research topic, and several prominent neurologists published material on photosensitive epilepsy, including Henry Gastow, who in 1951, while investigating seizures caused by intermittent light shining through trees, made brief mention of two children who seemed to meet the current definition of sunflower syndrome. Unlike the rest of the individuals described in the paper, these two boys seemed to search out and provoke their seizures by rapidly passing their hands in front of their eyes while looking into the sunlight. And this is likely the first report of sunflower syndrome in the modern medical literature. Gastow is quoted as saying, "Two children were searching for epileptogenic stimuli to provoke their absences. One of them by passing rapidly his hands with the fingers widespread before his eyes, the other by moving his hand rapidly from right to left in front of a window with colored glass." In 1954, the first case series that focused on patients who self-induced seizures by waving their hands in front of their eyes was published. The author, Graham Robertson, referred to these seizures as self-precipitated attacks related to photogenic epilepsy. He self-proclaimed to be the first to describe such attacks in a case series, and stated that a search of the literature, including that of sun worshipping, failed to reveal any reference to previous publications. And in the case series, Robertson detailed 4 patients. The first was described as a shy but charming girl. Her family believed that her hand waving was the result of the child's grandmother yelling at her to keep her hair out of her eyes when she was a kid. When asked why she hand waved, she would tell people that it was her silly business and that she wanted to. However, when she was reprimanded for hand waving, she would say that she couldn't help it. The second case was described as an intelligent 12-year-old schoolgirl. Her parents thought that her hand waving was just a funny little mannerism that had resulted from eye exercises that her doctor had instructed her to do to prevent squinting. The girl described the hand waving as a feeling that is difficult to describe, a feeling between satisfaction and not wanting to do it, something like satisfaction, but something else which cannot be explained. The third case was a 41-year-old woman who was described as a tennis player of world-class caliber. She was married, and when her husband would try to hold her hands down to prevent her from hand waving, he would say it felt like she was getting shocked. She referred to the sun as a magnet and stated that she was drawn to sunlight like a moth to a candle. The fourth case was described as an intelligent and cooperative boy. His hand waving was so intrusive that he could be going to kick a football, and he would have to stop and wave his hands before he was able to complete the punt. In 1958, then 4 years later, 2 more cases were reported. 2 girls aged 7 and 11 presented with attraction to the sun and hand waving induced seizures. The 7-year-old used her non-dominant hand and exclaimed her seizures were great, but also stated that she just had to do it. The 11-year-old girl used her dominant hand, stated that her hand waving episodes provoked a trance-like state and a dreamy feeling. And the authors of this case series believe that the two girls had discovered, and this was in their own words, a trick for inducing seizures. They also proposed that the behavior may have resulted from stress caused by tragic events that occurred in the girl's childhood. The impending loss of a nanny for one of the girls and the loss of a beloved horse for the other. In 1960, C. Whitty described a 7.5-year-old female whose seizures from interrupted light stimulus eventually developed into hand-waving episodes. When the girl was asked directly, she would deny that the attacks were pleasurable, but Whitty remarked that after an attack, she seemed noticeably more relaxed and content. Whitty also proposed several interesting hypotheses. He suggested that the hand waving could operate in a similar mechanism as addictive drugs, that it could provide sexual arousal, that it could be a protective mechanism, a neurotic response, a primitive behavior. He was kind of all over with his hypotheses. In 1962, another case series was published on a boy and a girl who both suffered from sun gazing and seizures associated with hand waving. Unlike many of the earlier published reports, both of these patients had notable family history of epilepsy. Also, unlike most of the earlier reports, both of these children responded relatively well to treatment, and the boy even became seizure-free for a period of time. Because these studies were so few and far between, a team of researchers in 1962 compiled the available case studies and compared them amongst each other. Of the 34 photosensitive epilepsies in their series, 21 were considered to be self-induced. 11 involved hand waving in the sun. They noticed a few interesting patterns, including that a majority of the patients were female, slow to reach developmental milestones, but had relatively normal mental states. Several patients even had above average IQs, including one who was a certifiable genius with an IQ of 165. Until about in the 1960s, the general consensus in the medical literature was that individuals were self-inducing their seizures by waving their hands in front of their eyes and creating a flickering of light that triggered a seizure. However, over the next couple of years, sentiment began to change. In 1961, Charles Simmons was quoted as saying, "It has been argued that rapid blinking by the patient as a compulsory neurotic symptom produces flicker. I am not convinced that this is always so. The blinking may be symptomatic of the seizure and not causal." Then in 1964, Livingston and Torres described the results of an EEG exam that suggested the attempt to induce flicker occurred at the same time as the onset of the seizure activity, not prior to it. And then in 1971, Francis R. Ames wrote a paper that directly questioned the self-induction classification used to describe the hand-waving induced seizures, and she stated, "This paper reports findings in 7 such patients and raises the possibility that what appears to be self-induction of seizures may in fact be an ictal phenomenon." That 1971 paper by Ames included the first photographs of hand waving in the literature. The photographs depicted 3 patients. The first was a 22-year-old woman who often felt compelled to go out into the sunlight and wave her hand in front of her eyes. She described her urge to hand wave as a curious feeling of annoyance and irritation that was too vague a feeling to describe properly. Like the patient described earlier, her parents initially thought she had performed her hand movements to brush hair away from her eye, and they made her change her hairstyle. Later, when she often performed the movements at a window in sunlight, they accused her of making secret signals to the neighbor. She felt guilty about the waving habit, and she denied getting any pleasure from it and said that it did not relieve her of stress or tension. The second was a 16-year-old man who, since the age of 5, often stared at the sun in a trance-like state and waved his left hand in front of his left eye. Growing up, the boy said he avoided playing games outside because his habit got the better of him. He said that while waving, he felt a sort of half-blankedness and a sort of uplifted feeling. During some of the episodes, he described hearing a zinging noise in his head. He also denied that the attacks gave him any pleasure or relief from tension. The third case was a woman who, since the age of 4, had seizures associated with hand waving from 1963 to 1967. This patient had been admitted to a psych ward, unfortunately, 3 times. One psychiatrist suggested that her hand waving was the attempt to draw attention to herself. The patient consistently denied being aware of the hand waving. 13 years later, Frances Ames once again published a paper examining this epilepsy. In this paper, she detailed a mother and a daughter who both suffered from attraction to sun and hand waving associated seizures. Interestingly, the daughter was the first case of a patient whose attraction to sunlight and hand waving was not associated with sensitivity to flickering light. So basically, when the researchers had her hooked up to an EEG, they were unable to induce abnormal brainwaves by flashing lights in her eyes. Ames reasoned that because of this, it was unlikely the child was using her hand to create a flicker pattern and induce a seizure. After detailing these cases, Ames concluded her paper by stating, a plea is made for careful neuropsychological reappraisal of the phenomenon manifested by patients with this type of photosensitive epilepsy. The name sunflower syndrome is suggested as preferable to self-induced. And this was the first mention of sunflower syndrome in the medical literature. Now, Frances R. Ames is a pretty fascinating neurologist. She was a human rights activist. She spoke out against the apartheid. She spoke out against the war on drugs. Her peers described her as the great and unorthodox protagonist. So really just a fascinating character who played a major role in the history of sunflower syndrome. Unfortunately, to this point, most of the medications were not effective. Some of the earlier medications used, like troxidone, actually caused photophobia or an intense fear of sunlight, almost the complete opposite of sunflower syndrome, not helpful at all. And some of the other medications, diphenylhydrolone, methylbarbital, and phenobarbital, were actually able to reduce seizures in some, but not all patients. Those drugs aren't really used anymore. In a 1980s single-dose trial of sodium valproate, which is still used today, some of you might be aware of this pharmaceutical product. There was results that showed subjective benefits like clear mind or reduced urge to hand wave, although there was not conclusive evidence that showed a reduction in the hand waving frequency. In 1985, the French neurologists Jean Cardy and Henri Gastow sent a letter to the editor of the New England Journal of Medicine stating that they had successfully treated 3 photosensitive patients, one of whom hand waved with fenfluramine. And it was this letter to the editor, which was written 35 years ago and somewhat buried in the medical literature and uncovered by Dr. Thiel, that eventually led to the current sunflower syndrome clinical trial investigating fenfluramine as a possible treatment. I'm sure some of you are familiar with that trial, and I believe more updates on that will be discussed in a different presentation. Then in 2001, a study on lorazepam in India was effective in reducing seizure frequency of 5 patients with hand waving associated seizures. However, lorazepam is not considered a viable long-term treatment option because the body builds up tolerance to it. In 2006, a self-inductive photosensitive epilepsy was compared to another known self-inductive epilepsy, hot water epilepsy, where kids will actually induce seizures by pouring hot water over their heads. The researchers noted several differences in the attitudes and behaviors of these 2 populations, though. Unlike the hot water epilepsy patients, the patients who had self-induced photosensitive hand waving episodes did not describe the feeling as enjoyable or pleasurable. In 2007, researchers in Oregon tested the use of filters to see if hand waving was provoked by different wavelengths of light. The researchers discovered that yellow-green filters were able to prevent seizure activity in 2 photosensitive patients with self-induced hand waving epilepsy. However, throughout the literature, people have reported the use of filtered glasses with varying effectiveness. Then in 2014, an EEG study found that a person with sunflower syndrome was able to produce the EEG abnormalities on command, which would seem to suggest that the seizures are at least partially inducible. The study also found that commercially available blue lenses could prevent the abnormal EEG findings in response to flickering light. In 2018, neurologists at Stanford described the clinical and electrographic features of sunflower syndrome in 13 of their patients. The patients were a majority female, suffered from eyelid myoclonia and absent seizures. About half of the patients had tonic-clonic, myoclonic, or absent seizures, in addition to their seizures caused by hand waving, and 2 of the patients had been misdiagnosed with a tic. In 2019, a couple of poster presentations were put together by the team at MGH detailing preliminary results from an online survey. The final results of that study were just accepted for publication last month, which will make about 8+ articles published on sunflower syndrome in just the past 2 years. These articles include literature reviews, EEG studies, preliminary clinical trial results, and the largest sunflower syndrome case series that's been published to date, and that was published by the team at MGH last year. Now, research is not a competition, but it is worth mentioning that once the results to that survey are published, that'll be about the 6th paper and abstracts published by Dr. Teal and her team at MGH on sunflower syndrome, which is a pretty impressive accomplishment. And then lastly, another thing I'd like to point out is that the research on sunflower syndrome has been conducted all over the world. The articles cited in this presentation alone came from both coasts of the United States, from across the pond in England, and Spain and Turkey and Egypt and South Africa and India and Australia. So that's really kind of a neat thing to think about. In conclusion, sunflower syndrome has appeared in the medical literature for almost 85 years, and there's still so much to learn. We're just getting started, and I'm really excited to see what we'll figure out about sunflower syndrome in the next few years. So thank you so much for listening to this presentation. Best of luck to everyone, and take care. Thank you.